Well, I was very inspired by Stefan's talk last, what was it, two weeks ago. This kind of like conceptual structure all the way to action. That was very cool. And I saw like some pieces of linguistics in it too. There was like this minimalist kind of like framework for representing the actions. That was very cool. And I thought I was kind of like embarrassed about linguistics because like we don't like that's a piece of linguistics, but we don't actually have anything that goes from like conceptual structure to action in our field yet. We would like to. So that was an inspiration. So in this talk, I'm gonna just kind of focusing. There's not going to be the conceptual structure. I'll be down at the kind of like speech action kind of level. Yeah, Gregor was right. This is phonetics. So like I'll try to be like as kind as possible. Like I'm not going to assume like a lot of background on phonetics, but definitely please feel free to stop me if you have like any questions along the way. I want to start with just some acknowledgements. I mean, it's going to sound like a little bit like a story. I hope that's okay, but it'll give you maybe an idea of like kind of like where I'm coming from. So I just so this what I'm going to talk about today. It kind of started with this collaboration with Karthik Durvasula and Alexei Kochetov, who are professors here in the U.S. at different universities, and we were presenting a paper together back in 2019, and there was a PhD student in the audience who is Sejin Oh, and afterwards she came to us and she said that the talk that you gave, like that's what I want to work on for my PhD. And we said, well, okay, she already had like a PhD position at a different university, but we kind of like worked it out for her to come to Yale and kind of collect the data that was needed for the project, except that before she'd gotten too far along in collecting data, the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. And like, I don't know what your experience was, but for this particular project, it meant that we couldn't collect any more experimental data. And so we had a pivot with the PhD project from thinking about like addressing the question by running more experiments to addressing the question through like a computational modeling. And it really, the dissertation really became more of a kind of like modeling a dissertation. And it was kind of in the context of not having a very satisfying model for the data that I kind of turned to DFT at this time. I'd read some papers in graduate school on DFT, maybe like 15 or 20 years ago, actually. And one member of my graduate school cohort, Kevin Roon, we had the same advisor, and he ended up using DFT for his dissertation. And we had lots of long discussions kind of like back then. But like during COVID, when we couldn't run experiments, I discovered this like, I discovered the tutorial and the Cosavina package, and that really kind of deserves to be in the acknowledgements because I found it both kind of like enlightening and also highly useful, highly practical for modeling the data. So when we came back to classes in 2021, my first seminar was with Michael Stern and Manasvi Chaturvedi. And we kind of started thinking about like application of DFT to other issues in speech production. And then other students in the department, they got interested in DFT projects, including a couple of post-bac students, Irene Yi and Noah Macy, who are now doing PhDs at Stanford and Berkeley, respectively. And we're still kind of collaborating on some kind of DFT-related projects. But anyway, what I'll be presenting here, it's work done in Mike's qualifying paper and then some extensions of that. And then I'll be kind of spending maybe most of the time on this model of data coming from Sejin's dissertation. And she's now on her second postdoc. She's at Hanyang Institute for Phonetics and Cognitive Science. which is in Seoul, Korea, and they're hosting the Laboratory Phonology Conference this year, which is one that I like to go to. Okay, so particularly the model of this data, it's like pretty preliminary. We're planning on presenting it at this LabFon conference, which is in June. So like any feedback would be helpful and probably something that we could like implement before then. So it's like really a good time to get advice. Okay, so that's the long story. I don't know if there's time left for the talk, but that's the acknowledgments. Okay, so you guys, so I'm now gonna show you some artwork. So you probably know that like brains don't exist in isolation. This is some artificial intelligence generated artwork. It's what I got when I told my AI assistant to give me a brain on the open plane, interacting with the environment. And this is what it gave me. Of course, so brains don't exist in isolation. They develop in bodies with sensors and end effectors. And also, as a kind of phonetician that studies the tongue and tongue movements, we have to remind ourselves as well that end effectors don't exist in isolation. This is a tongue from a cadaver that was extracted in order to kind of study the biomechanical properties. But let me tell you, these things, they're a lot more interesting when they're moving and so the natural kind of a natural situation is for the central nervous system to be linked to the end effectors so that, you know, when we're speaking, we're changing the world around us, we're sensing the changes in the world, and then we're constantly responding to that changing world. This is okay. So one more thing to say before I launch. I just want to make this point about language diversity. So it's cool to be a linguist that's interested in cognitive science. One of the nice things about languages is their heterogeneity, in the sense that like each human language represents, in a way, a different experiment. So you have a human population, each endowed with similar brains, end effectors, and ambitions. And they develop patterns of speech movement that differ in some ways, but not in others. So some patterns of speech can be particularly revealing about the dynamics relating intention to behavior. So when you work on language, instead of thinking about creative experiments to probe behavior, I mean, we do some of that too, but we can sometimes just sample from a different language population because nature has already given us the experiment that we desire. And so we'll be using some of that typology today, differences across languages. Okay, so I'm talking about speech actions from intentions in this talk. And the kind of the end effector level is the articulatory kinematics. So we can, with some, okay, so we can see the lips quite easily. We could take pictures of the lips in camera. If we want to look at the tongue and the larynx and the velum, it's like a little bit more involved. In my lab, we look at this in different ways. One of them, to get high temporal resolution, is to actually glue sensors onto the end effectors so that we can get high kind of spatial temporal resolution of the movements. We can study the kinematic variables, the position, the velocity, and the displacement of these movements. So that's kind of the data, the articulatory kinematic side. And then we're interested in the laws that govern the kinematics. And so this is what I refer to as the articulatory dynamics, particularly if we can write differential equations that account for our kinematic variables. This is an example of one such differential equation. You might recognize it as a damped mass spring oscillator. In articulatory dynamics, we use a critically damped version so that it doesn't oscillate, but this is a kind of like a plot. This was one of the kind of original proposals for articulatory dynamics, going back to this task dynamics paper, Saltzman and Munhall. 1989. By now, this is known to be wrong, or at least empirically inadequate in particular ways. But I'm going to be using it in this talk. It's a very well-known and kind of version of the gesture, dynamics for the gesture. And for the things that I'm going to talk about, it's not going to, the ways that it's wrong aren't going to matter. But in kind of like other work, actually, that Mike and I are working on right now, we're trying to have a better characterization of this articulatory dynamics. But the main thing that I want to talk about today is kind of like a next level of articulatory intentions. So like our articulatory dynamics have like a set of control parameters. And the way we've been thinking about this kind of another level of the system, the articulatory intentions, is as specifying these control parameters that will enter into the dynamics. We'll be talking, or I'll be talking today about this XO, which is basically the target, the point detractor of this of the gestural dynamics, and thinking about articulatory intentions in terms of dynamic neural fields that will kind of stabilize in order to supply the control parameters for the articulatory dynamics. So that's kind of like where we're going. These pieces that I talked about here, so in some places in the literature, they're referred to as like, so that articulatory intention side as phonological encoding, and then this kind of kinematics and dynamics as maybe phonetics or kind of speech motor control. One of the things that I want to do kind of first, so I have like two pieces of the talk, so with kind of two separate empirical and modeling components. But the point of the first part is I want to problematize a kind of a non-dynamical view of phonological encoding, which is probably still mainstream view. So I guess I want to problematize probably mainstream view of phonological encoding. And then we'll look at some basically empirical facts that are kind of inconsistent with the view, and then propose a DFT model. The specific facts, which you don't have to get this now, it will come from contrastive hyperarticulation. I'll tell you about that slowly. And then we have basically some ideas for how to couple the DNFs for articulatory intention to kind of lexical items. And then this piece, this lexical phonological coupling, that's going to play a role in the second part of the talk as well. So we'll be looking at some facts from Russian, and the aim here is to have an integrated dynamics of this articulation side and the intention side, to kind of put those equations together. Okay, so so that's the I'm just gonna set realize I don't have a clock. Okay, here we go. Now I've got a timer. Make sure. Okay, so the first part of this is so like a kind of standard view, which is going to be kind of problematic for the data that we're looking at, is that like in phonological encoding, you have something like a symbol that you select. This would be like a phoneme. So like a ta, like the first sound in the words like 10, town, tool. Tog is not a word of English, but it's a possible word. Or the voiced version of this da in words like den and down and dog. Dual is not an actual word, but it could be. So in phonological encoding, whether you're producing real words or new words or made up words for the first time, you'll choose some like category, and then you'll kind of like ship it off to the phonetics. So you have to find something that you can do with your movement, with your action, that would cause people to kind of recognize this phonemic category. Sometimes this is called implementation. So you need to take some symbol and then turn it into like some continuous measure. One of the continuous measures, maybe the primary one that differentiates these two categories in the phonetics, is something called voice onset time, or VOT. This is the time, so what I've schematized here is for 10, you'll have the tongue tip move up to the alveolar ridge, stop the airflow, and then release. So you'll get some silence here. And then after you release the constriction, after some period of time, you'll get some vocal fold vibration, which will tell you that you're at the vowel. And this interval of time from the release of the constriction to the onset of this voicing, that's called voice onset time, and it's the primary dimension that differentiates a ten and den. I don't know if do I need that much background? Have you guys ever heard of VOT before?
I certainly have. I don't know.
Oh, okay. All right. Good. Good. Sorry. No.
It's good. It's good. Yeah.
Just want to make sure. So like when we measure this, we measure it based upon like looking at a speech waveform like this. So this is the VOT, this kind of aperiodic energy that precedes the periodic energy. This would be for the vowel, and then this would be a shorter a period of VOT, shorter VOT for da than for ta. Okay, so so the problem with this view is that it seems that you can't just go from the symbol to an implementation of the symbol. There are systematic factors which implement that, which affect that, the kind of continuous variables. So one of these is related to competition in the lexicon. Competition in the lexicon, so the lexicon level leads to differences that are measurable in terms of VOT, this continuous dimension. So this is referred to as contrastive hyperarticulation. So hyperarticulation meaning kind of like an extreme kind of VOT value. And contrastive because the function of this hyperarticulation is to increase the distance between competing lexical items. So this is a classic result from 2009, Bass, Burke, and Goldrick's paper, and they had three conditions there. You would produce a word, a target word that might have no competitor in the lexicon. So for example, tool. It doesn't have the voice competitor dual. It just happens not to be a word, or maybe dual is a word. Never mind, but bad example. Not spelled like this, at least. Anyway, forget about it. So tool has no competitor in the lexicon, and then you have a word like pen, which does have a competitor. Den is a real word, and then you have a word. So there's a context, no context distinction. So you produce the word 10, den is not shown in the context as a competitor, so you're just producing 10. And then you have another condition where you have 10 and den both on the screen, and you're told to say 10. So these different conditions, which include the experimental manipulation, but also just the structure of the lexicon, like is there a competitor there or not, they affect VOT. So you get the longest VOT, meaning you're most T-like, when you have a competitor in the lexicon and it's in context. You get a little bit, you get this kind of decrease when you have a competitor in the lexicon, it's not in the context, and then you have the shortest VOT when there's no competitor. So you lengthen the VOT in order to be different from your competitor. At least that's the kind of like functional account of this. So you can't just go from that symbolic category to the phonetics. The kind of active competitors matter. And the way this has been kind of thought about is that you have in the lexicon like pen and den. This is your kind of competitor. The competitor becomes somewhat active because they share some aspects of the phonological representation. So we get through interactive activation, some activation of this competitor. And then that competitor activates this. So ta and da differ on VOT. And then we have to kind of resolve this partially active da in order to get these VOT results.
So this will be speakers who just read. They read a text, or
yeah, it's the task itself is there's an experimenter who is a confederate in the task. And so they turn it into a little game where you're given 3 words on the screen, and then the participant in the experiment has one of them circled. That's the word that they're supposed to say. and then the experimental confederate is supposed to pick the right word. And so you get some like motivation from producing it in a way that the experimenter can understand it. So it's a little bit interactive. So Mike has run a version of this using Zoom during COVID and gotten kind of similar kinds of results, but also using that confederate setup. There is some evidence that you can get these types of effects. So it's also been found in large speech corpora. So just of spontaneous speech, you still get effects of whether there's a minimal pair or not. And there's some evidence that you can get this just from reading word lists, but the kind of interactive context is where it was first discovered. Okay, so Mike worked on this a DFT model of this phenomenon, and it's a single layer field, a DNF for VOT. And the idea that we pursued is that you have your target for so this would be like a voiceless target. 690 or 69 milliseconds is around the average voice onset time for a voiceless stop. So we have an input kind of into the field at this voiceless end for the voiceless target, and then you have the voice competitor. And what Mike did is vary the activation of the voice competitor from excitatory to inhibitory with different degrees, and then simulated the VOT under these kind of different levels of competitor activation. So as you vary the amplitude of the competitor, you get so the kind of the width of these inputs to the field is also important. This width of 30 milliseconds also kind of mirrors what we see in kind of natural distributions of VOT in speech corpora. But the observation is that as you kind of like increase the inhibition of the competitor, then you can kind of push where this voiceless input stabilizes away from the inhibited competitor. So this is as you increase inhibition, you get increased VOT because the voiceless input is stabilizing at the kind of like more at the higher end of the VOT field. If you have some kind of positive activation of the competitor, then you can actually get hypo articulation. So you can get the VOT kind of pulled towards the competitor, which is actually something that is observed in speech errors. So there's also kind of speech data that show this. But the contrastive hyperarticulation facts are here. And these two lines here are the levels of competitor activation or competitor amplitude that are needed in order to derive the results from the Base-Burke and Goldrick. So this is, so small degree of inhibition, and then this is a larger degree of inhibition. Any questions about this? Mike, did I explain that clearly enough?
So that's from input, and you're modeling the. Is it that you're modeling a peak standing there and under the influence of these two inputs?
Yeah, so we're assuming that the location of the peak is the VOT value. Okay. So at this point, we haven't fed this to articulation yet. That's the second part of the talk. Okay. We're just assuming that the articulatory apparatus will be successful in achieving this target. So basically modeling the VOT as the intended VOT from the field.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask about the inhibition versus excitation idea?
Yeah.
So you might think with context, you might get more co-excitation of den and ten.
Yes.
But what you're actually modeling for hyperarticulation is you're getting more suppression of den.
Yes.
When it's in that contextual condition, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
so you're thinking about that competition is resolving itself in another layer, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So that is the perfect segue to the next
Yeah,
slide,
okay.
actually.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, so wait a minute, that seems counterintuitive at first, right?
Right.
Because when the competitor is in the context, it at the lexical item, it should be receiving more activation, right?
Right.
And what we've done is we've taken that greater activation at the lexical level, and we've turned that into greater inhibition into the field.
Right.
Um, so, uh, um, so where do these, so in this result, we just, we kind of cheated, right? We just kind of scaled the competitor, the competitor amplitude, but that comes from somewhere. And so like the follow-up is, well, where does that come from? And so we have this lexical kind of phonetic coupling distributions for the initial consonant planning. So each of these, this is the kind of like basic structure here. The neural fields, they're governing planning on phonetic dimensions. I mean, in this case, there's VOT, but of course, that's not the only dimension that you have to plan. You have to plan where you're going to form the constriction in the vocal tract. That's the constriction location. How narrow will the constriction be? That's the constriction degree. So here the lexical items are modeled as activation nodes, dynamic nodes, and then they're coupled to each of these dimensions. So the coupling is bidirectional. So the active lexical item, that sends input to the coupled fields, but then the active fields also send input back into the coupled lexical items. So this is a mechanism that will excite the phonological neighbors during the planning of a target word. I mean, we have to get this from spontaneous speech as well, but in the context of the competitor on the screen, that would be another source of input into the node level. So here's the, I guess the novel thing, or something that we didn't get from the tutorial. So here's the proposal is that we have this kind of polarity, what we call the delta. So okay, so the polarity is whether the input to the field, the competitor input, is excitatory or inhibitory. For different phenomenon, we need both. And so it is a bit of a paradox in the modeling literature, like how do you get this both excitatory effects and inhibitory effects into the field? So the proposal is that there's another parameter called delta, which keeps track of the difference between the current field state. So these would be the phonetic fields to which the lexical item is coupled, and then the lexical item's preferred field state, which is the part of the field that the lexical item is coupled to. So the idea is that this kind of like difference, yeah, so we keep track of delta at each time point, so it's also dynamically evolving. And so we get this difference between the field state and the preferred field state. Okay, so when delta is like relatively low, so this is like a small difference between where the field is at and the preferred field state. In this situation, then input is excitatory. But when delta becomes sufficiently large, meaning the field is in this dispreferred state, then the lexical to phonetic input becomes inhibitory. So
there might be a way how this would emerge from one of our more generic mechanisms. Are you familiar with the three-layer networks? Change detection. So there is
with a memory trace?
It's three layers where there's an excitatory layer, an inhibitory layer that's shared, and another excitatory layer that's sort of a working memory kind of layer.
Okay.
And essentially that top layer does something like that. That is, if you have an item that in the memory, it will create a inhibitory peak, and that sort of inhibits on the side. And so if you're overlapping with that item, you in a certain metric distance, you will feel inhibition. That leads, for instance, to change detection that you only answer if it's sufficiently different from what you currently had.
Oh.
Actually, John used this, or it was actually earlier, but analogous repulsion from landmarks is like that. You would have some representation where these landmarks are, and then an individual item that's at the top layer would sense inhibition from neighboring landmarks. I can point you to that.
Yeah.
We have it actually, maybe even in the book. Do we have it in the book? Yeah, we might have it in the book, but it might not be easy to recognize that it's the same thing. But
That would be
I
great.
took
Yeah,
an
I think that would be
analogy.
really useful. So this is the part that we need something like this.
Yeah.
And
Goes
so
back to
like
Jeff Johnson, who did that with John and me. So I'll point you to that. Maybe if
yeah,
follow
we'll
that
we'll
up in a
definitely we'll explore
discussion.
the 3-layer. That would be great. Okay, so yeah, so yeah, this is like a specific example, but I think we pretty much like the idea is clear. So I think I'll skip this, but we'll come back to this kind of like polarity reversal mechanism. So this is just Den getting activation from constriction location, constriction degree, and then this is the delta, that delta measure, that as the peak over time, as the peak starts to form at the voiceless end, then you get this switch in delta, and then we start to get inhibition at this end of the field. That's the type of effect that we're going for with this polarity reversal. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, so this was contrastive hyperarticulation. But my goodness, like once you have this, once you have like the DFT concepts kind of like floating around, almost everything looks like DFT in speech. Like I really think that this is like a really ripe area for research. There's so much low-hanging fruit. It's part of the reason why, like the same seminar that I taught with Mike and Monasvi, I'm teaching again this semester. So some of the things that we've worked on, so the trace effects in speech errors, this is actually when your competitor is giving excitatory input, it kind of pulls the target towards the competitor. There's phonetic convergence and divergence effects. So this is like when you're talking to an interlocutor, your VOT or other phonetic dimensions as well, but just because we've been talking about VOT, will drift in the direction of your interlocutor if you like them. If you don't like them, then it won't. And it can even drift away. So this also very much looks like the single field dynamics with kind of like inhibiting versus exciting a representation or some input into the field that's based upon your interlocutor. And there's empirical results showing that you don't actually have to hear your interlocutor. How you think that they're going to speak can also influence your own pronunciation. And we've been modeling those effects. So this is work with Noah Macy, who's going to present some of this this summer at LabFon, and kind of like also a shout out to my my roommate from graduate school, Kevin Roon, who was one of the first to really do like perception and production kind of interaction with DFT. And then kind of what we've been talking about this semester, a lot of kind of code switching. So when you switch from one language to another, so these papers are English, Spanish, and English, Greek bilinguals, then you retain like some trace, some impact of the previous language's phonetic category on your current pronunciation for a period of time. There's a window of about 5 seconds. It's kind of like an interesting window, and then this effect kind of like slows over time. So that's also just very interesting phenomenon that it seems very well suited to DFT. So maybe somebody in the class will come up with a model of that. That's what we're discussing right now. Okay, so that's the first, I guess, first part. The other thing I want to get to is integrated dynamics. So this is going from the intention level, kind of like feeding into the articulatory dynamics. And to do that, I'm going to talk you through some facts about Russian palatalization and incomplete neutralization. So I'll kind of try and go slow with that. So like this view that we had before, basically I want to replace it with kind of like an integrated dynamics that goes from the articulatory intentions, kind of like providing the control parameters for the articulatory dynamics. So that's this. Okay, so so you remember that like not all T's have the same VOT, right? So like when it comes to Russian, not all palatalized labials, so represented here as pya, but it also goes for bya and vya and sla, and almost all of the consonants can be palatalized. So not all of these palatalized consonants have the same spatial temporal properties. So don't worry, I'm going to give like an overview and then I'll go through like a little bit more slowly. But here's the main point. What I want to tell you is that like evidence for an integrated dynamics of intention and articulation comes from looking at the very fine phonetic differences between these Russian words. So they're going to be words like pyok, which is the third person singular past form of the verb bake, and pyot. Are there any Russians in the audience?
I'm Bulgarian, so some of the things are a bit similar.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a native speaker Russian.
Okay, you should be saying these words. Can you read these words?
Sure. So it's pёк and pьёт.
Fantastic. Thank you. So these are going to be the kind of the stars of the show in this second half. So a few kind of like so the phenomenon in like the phonetics literature is known as incomplete neutralization. So palatalized stops in Russian, they differ from the stop glide sequences in English. So this pya, it's not the same as say like English words like pew or puke. So I'm going to show you that. And then the kind of like the short version of this kind of comparison of these two kind of like Russian stops is that the pya in pyot is different from the pya in pyok. Now they're kind of like written in the same way. You both kind of like call them, so like categorically they're probably both, I don't know what, Yulia, would you say that these are like the same sound categorically?
Yeah, so they're considered the same sounds, right? It's p and then the yod. Yeah.
So,
but this in the first case, p, it's kind of get fused more tightly. The vocal and the the consonant.
Perfect. Yes, that's right. So that's what people say, that they're the same category, but yet there's going to be some subtle differences, and we're going to kind of derive these differences. Okay, so a little bit more slowly. So here's the first, the kind of like the fact about Russian. There's the kind of palatalized stops, and then there's what's typically called the plain stops, but there's work showing that the plain stops are actually velarized. So what does that mean? This is like a mid-sagittal view of the tongue, and this is the tongue body bunching up at the palate for our palatalized version. And then this is like a more posterior constriction, further back constriction for the velarized or the plain stop. So we have our palatalized and our plain stop, and they differ in the location of the tongue body by about a centimeter, about 10 millimeters. This is like pretty consistent across subjects. This was Alexei Kochetov's kind of a classic paper on this, 2006. But it's pretty similar. Like not everybody's like tongue is the same size, but like the difference between the kind of palatal constriction and the velar constriction is pretty consistent across speakers. So the idea is to have a tongue body constriction location field. So we have a DNF that is basically providing our target in space for the tongue body constriction. So at the kind of front end, we have the palatal constriction, and then at a further back end, we have the velar constriction. So this DNF kind of stabilizes, and then the activation peak feeds that value of the tongue body constriction location as the target to the gesture. So the dynamics look like this. So these are the articulatory dynamics on this side using the damped mass spring model of the gesture, and then our DNF for tongue body constriction location here. And so here we have an input that's at the kind of front end of the field, and then here an input that's at the back end of the field. And so we let these we let these run. And then when the peak stabilizes, that drives our articulatory dynamics towards the target over time. So this is the idea, to couple the intentions this side to the articulatory dynamics. And that's so that, you know, stuff that happens, so like selection effects, inhibition effects, this kind of level of intentional dynamics can be sensitive to the larger kind of neurocognitive ecology of the speech planning process, because we observe these types of effects.
So, so you read out the peak location to the
Yes.
articulatory dynamics, or is it some kind of dynamic coupling?
It's read out.
Yeah.
So so
There's
precisely
actually a
the
way one could do that in a more principled way, but again, it's probably not so important. But it
Well,
could be done more within. Yeah, I can also check me offline. I don't want to distract you too much, but there might be a way
well, no,
to
but
do
this
that
is
more.
this is why we're, you know, very excited to be presenting here, is to, so like the 3-layer field for our polarity reversal, and then if we can, yeah,
So
we could see.
I had done some work with Eric Jackson at NYU, looking at some speech production effects and stuttering. And we kind of put together a toy model that does kind of what Gregor says, takes field positions, and essentially couples them to behavioral dynamics, which creates kind of a fixed point attractor for an articulatory system, essentially, which is what you're reading out, right?
Yep.
We could talk offline about
Okay. Yeah,
that kind
that'd be
of
great.
model, and yeah.
Great.
Right.
So okay, so that's this part. The tongue body position actually in English and Russian is pretty similar. There is however, like a temporal difference. So like if we just look at the spatial location of the tongue body at its maximum constriction, then a word like, you know, puke or pew in English is similar to the pyot in Russian. But the temporal dynamics are different, which we can see by looking at this electromagnetic articulography data. This is not a comparison here. This is just an example of what that kind of data looks like and how we analyze it. So this is the trajectory of this kind of middle sensor on the tongue body. And this is the kind of the peak for the ya portion. This is actually an English, let's see, I think this is butte. So we have a ba here and a ya. And then we parse out some kind of articulatory landmarks. So the onset of movement based upon the velocity profile. So we're looking at a threshold of the peak velocity to determine when that kind of like controlled movement begins. Okay, so if we compare the English and Russian lip and tongue coordination across languages, like I said before, we get similar spatial displacement. I'm showing the tongue body on the bottom panels. This is for 4 different speakers of English and 4 different speakers of Russian. So we have the tongue body on the bottom. And then this is, it's not the lower lip like I showed in the last slide. It's actually lip aperture. So the distance between the lips, we consider this to be the target. So like small lip aperture means the lips kind of come together. So these are the kinematic trajectories. We observe similar spatial displacement and similar lag, but we're able to identify like what I think is the real substantive difference between Russian and English in terms of the coordination of the movements. It's not obvious from the kinematic trajectories in this way because it shows up in a certain property of covariation between temporal intervals. Okay, so this is a schematic of the first kind of gesture, meaning the lip gesture. And then this is a schematic for the tongue gesture, the tongue body gesture. And we parsed out like the onset and the target and these types of landmarks using the velocity profile. And then we look at the duration of gesture 1 and then the duration of the lag between the gestures. So the onset of the second minus the onset of the first. So this onset to onset interval. So in the relationship between these two intervals, we found very, very clear differences between English and Russian. So these are those results. So as you see variation in the first gesture duration, for the English data, as first gesture duration increases, then we also see an increase in this onset to onset interval. That's represented here by this linear regression line. So what that means, the way that we interpret that, is that there's kind of like sequential timing here, in that the start of the second gesture is kind of yoked to the completion or achievement of target of this first gesture. That means you're not allowed to start this first gesture or the second gesture until the first gesture achieves some target. So if you're slower to do that, then you'll also be delayed on the second gesture. So that's this relationship here. On the other hand, when we look at Russian, there's no such correlation, meaning that you can have plenty of variation in this first gesture duration, but it doesn't impact when the second gesture starts. So we interpret that as the second gesture here actually being dependent only on the onset of this first gesture. So they're not sequentially timed, they're synchronously timed. Now synchrony is kind of like a tricky concept because there's actually no main effect of language on this onset to onset lag measure, right? You can see that there's quite a difference in variation, but there's no like main effect. They're largely synchronous in both languages on average, but there's a very strong effect, strong interaction with language and this gesture 1 duration in the linear mixed effects model. So, so we interpret that as kind of like different coordination regimes between the two gestures. The gestures are synchronous in that the kind of statistical dependency is between the onsets here. So the go signal, so to speak, for the second gesture is actually the first gesture. You don't wait for anything. That's the case of Russian, but not for English. Okay, so this is kind of like a background to establish these kind of basic differences between the English, which is this kind of like, stop, glide sequence, and then the Russian, which is this single kind of like palatalized stop. Okay, so now comes the incomplete neutralization part. So like I was just comparing these two, what I call the underlying palatal. So like in words like bake, like pyok, nobody would dispute that this is a palatal. But in the assimilatory palatal, the kind of Russian linguists tell us that this is actually a plain stop. But because it's followed by this glide here, it becomes palatalized. So this is kind of derived. It becomes palatalized because of its environment, whereas in this case, you're just palatalized all the way through. So even though we consider these to be the same kind of category, the same speech category, they're not contrastive. So there couldn't be another word that has the non-palatalized, segment here and means something different, right? So they're the same category, but there's a phonetic difference between those. So we're going to report that and then derive that with the model. So first step here is, so this is the same like covariation measure, the first gesture duration by the onset lag that we looked at. These were the results for English versus the Russian underlying palatals. And now these are just comparing the two types of palatals, the kind of underlying versus assimilatory palatals. That's what we called them in the paper. So this underlying version versus the assimilatory one, both of them have like basically flat lines here, meaning as gesture 1 duration increases, we don't see a delay of gesture 2. So this looks like in terms of that coordination measure, the dependency is actually just between the onsets. In other words, you just go. You don't have to wait for gesture 2. Now that said, if you look, you can see the kind of the gray lines are actually on top of the red lines here. So, and this is like a kind of a small but significant difference. So in terms of like our measure of coordination, it looks like the Russian palatals are the same, but there are these kind of like small measurable differences. One of them is in this onset lag measure. So this is the underlying versus the assimilatory. And then the other is in the tongue body position. So this is the tongue body position at the start of the movement. They both achieve the same target ultimately, but at the start of the movement, where we detect the onset of movement, you see like a more retracted tongue back for the assimilatory case. So like, and I kind of like primed you to think about these as the assimilatory cases, the plane stop is being velarized because like we showed that there's that difference, right? So the kind of like idea in deriving this difference is that your assimilatory palatal, like it starts out with this kind of like velar kind of component, but ultimately it needs to be a palatal. So this is the kind of assimilatory property. So this is the kind of full disclosure here. This is the part of the data that that Sejin really struggled with in modeling using task dynamics and articulatory phonology in the dissertation, because there's really tricky facts here. This data suggests that the statistical dependency is between the onsets. They're starting at the same time, and yet there's a delay. Right, the assimilatory palatal, it's starting later in time, and it's starting from a further back position. So what it really looks like is that the tongue is pulled back first, and then it's allowed to move towards its palatal. But you never hear any of this because it all happens while the lips are closed, right? Because it's a labial. So there's like this action happening with the tongue that suggests something going on in the intentional dynamic. So so here's our kind of like the state of our thinking at this point is that we have input at both the palatal and the velar locations. And then the field first stabilizes. The field first stabilizes at the velar end, and then we have some, polarity shift that pushes it in the other direction. So I guess I'll play it one more time. So this is the positive input, and then the polarity shift, actually the same type of mechanism that kind of we propose for the contrastive hyperarticulation drives the gesture in the other direction. So we have first, this is the movement towards the velar, and then this is the movement towards the palatal. And then this explains as well why the movement towards the palate in this direction, it starts later. It starts later because we detect that onset from the velocity peak. So this really looks like the start of the movement in the kinematics. And it's starting from further back because the gesture is first driven back by this velar input. So the proposal is that something about this like velar target, it persists in the intentional dynamics long enough to like adjust the articulatory, drive the articulatory dynamics in a little bit different direction, but it doesn't persist long enough to affect the way people interpret this in terms of a category. So it's a transient metastability.
But there is a potential that this could emerge. I can't so quickly see if it goes in the right direction. It could emerge from this more general picture in that there is a timing difference between excitatory and inhibitory coupling. Essentially, the excitator comes first, and then it brings up the inhibition that will then establish itself later, and that could be sort of a way how sequentiality could come in there. That might be worthwhile.
That's actually, I think like Mike, didn't you say something like that in our, like the, like the last thing you said out the door in our meeting this morning? It's like,
Yeah.
I hadn't shown this to Mike before. And I just mentioned to it, and he's like, could it be something about the sequentiality of the, so that in this simulation, they're actually both dumped into the field at the same time, but there could be sequentiality in the intentional dynamics. The trick is to make sure that we still can get this effect. That's the trick. And this became very difficult with task dynamics and articulatory phonology because any kind of shifting of the gestural phasing in order to get the observed onset lag or to get sequentiality between two control regimes, two different gestures, it ended up getting us a statistical dependency between those two. But maybe if we keep it in the tongue body, you know, it could, it's worth trying, worth exploring a bit. Okay, so so this at least like kind of like qualitatively gets us the two effects that we were looking for. So these are the simulations over like 100 runs, and we're getting like a later a delay of the assimilatory palatalization, so this longer onset lag, and the start of the movement is more back, more retracted, which is kind of like what we were trying to get from the data. Okay, so I should wrap up. Like, I guess people are dropping off anyway, so
with the time shift, it's late for you guys. Have fun.
Yeah. So basically, I wanted to drop this integrated dynamics, and I did come across, so like John mentioned this, it's like some work with Eric Jackson. So like I did come across this kind of like TDA, kind of like DFT. Like I don't know, like this was I think a LabFon 2016 poster, and I don't know. Yeah, I'd love to hear where this is at, and because it seems like there's something quite common, like in terms of like what we're proposing here, and so love to pick your brain about this some more.
Yeah, cool.
And then so I guess just to wrap up, the kind of like the empirical point here is that the competition at the level of the lexicon, and also like other environmental factors, which I didn't talk about here, like the convergence, divergence types effects, they show up in these kind of like phonetic measurements of speech. And so this gives us like a kind of like a nice window. I mean, I take it as evidence that these kind of intentions, the gestural targets, they are dynamic. They're influenced by, you know, kind of like this broader kind of like ecology of speech, including like other active kind of, you know, nodes or representations in the system fields. And like we found DFT to be, you know, highly appropriate for integrating these dynamics. And I'm keen to learn more about things that we can try in this domain. And also like you know, Stefan's talk last week, kind of like working back from our kind of like intention and like speech levels back towards conceptual structure. Mike has kind of served as a bridge with Maria Pinago's a brain lab, and they work more on kind of conceptual structure. So hopefully we get to put this together at CogSci. I don't know, they'll tell us pretty soon, right? But looking forward to the kind of possible opportunity to discuss that further. So I'll leave you with one more piece of art.
Great. Well, outstanding. Thank you very much. This was very, very stimulating, just amazing. Maybe I can ask one question. So I don't know if you know, I go back when I first came from physics into, you know, more motor control and then cognition. I went to Haskins actually, and I interacted with Kevin Manal and with Elliot Salzman and so on. And so we had a kind of a debate for a while about this notion of articulate dynamics. And I would say that what they have done is, I would say, low pass filtering. That is the oscillator, goes to the attractor, but the function of the oscillator is really just to translate the jump of the target into some kind of time course. And I always felt that, so I made models of the same kind for reaching movements and things like that. And I looked at coordination there and always felt that there is active generation of time. That is, it's more like a limit cycle that has its own time course and will even resist going early. Like in this model, if you put the articulator right to the attractor, it will just stay there, right? It doesn't have a required time course. And I'm wondering, and now you're looking at subtle effects of timing of sort of the parameters, and I'm wondering that would interact with that kind of coordination at the movement level. So I'm asking, so first of all, if that connects to anything I can say that in DFT, it's linked to this interface between the field picture, population peaks, and what we call rate code picture, where ultimately in the periphery you have like an ordinate dynamical system. And in that picture, we actually think that the oscillators, neural oscillators, might be actually the level at which that happens. So that's why there's a bit of a theory behind it.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, coordination is also something that I would say thinking about, but also kind of like rethinking in some ways. Like, so one of the things about like some of the approaches, like using limit cycles for coordination, you can get like relative durations of movements from the limit cycles. But the way that they've been used together with the way that they've been used together with the gestures and the triggering mechanisms has been I guess you could say it makes this prediction that coordination should be all about when things start. And in some of so in other words, there's like when you go, and then the duration of the duration of the movement. This is what so like Hosang Nam's with a coupled oscillator a model of coordination, which I gathered from the poster that I showed with John Spencer, that's actually a part that was like it was in the Tada model, but actually like not included in the poster. So like I was gathering from that there's that was more like this getting coordination from like sequentiality and maybe like condition of satisfaction, which is kind of like more related to like where the kind of the achievements of those targets as opposed to like when they start. Like there was some like reasoning that like if you know all the parameters, then like you don't have to really keep like if you know all the parameters, it should be enough to trigger the start of the movement at the right time, because you'll know like the kind of the stiffness and the way that it will unfold in time. You'll know when the target is achieved, and so you don't really have to keep track of that so much because it at the level of coordination, because you can derive it from when you start the gesture and the rest of the and the rest of the dynamics. And like the data that we've been looking at in our lab on coordination is not consistent with that idea, or at least not, that doesn't seem to be the full picture. So like coordination is really something that we're kind of like, I guess, kind of shaking the models a little bit right now, because we have, I mean, now we have kind of richer empirical data than was available, 20 or 30 years ago, to kind of like look at large numbers of subjects, look at trends, use the kind of the variance in the data to be kind of like informative about what's being controlled. This is like this is kind of, I don't know how tangential this is to your question, but this is kind of like
I haven't followed this. I don't even know some of the models you're referring to. In the old times, one of the fundamental arguments was that you can vary rate. You can speak fast or slow, and that requires some kind of preservation. Right? The timing is relative, is sort of, and that's where the phase idea comes in. And so in that respect, I don't think it would be enough just to synchronize the onsets. You'd have to keep line to time. Is that true? I mean, is that still thought that I don't know if when you change rate, do things proportionally change?
Not in speech rate is extremely fraught. As a one, it's a difficult dependent measure. Like you can tell people you can tell people to speak faster, and some of them will do it. And you can tell people to speak slower, and some of them would do it. That much is true. But how they do it is extremely variable from individual to individual. Some people have like a modulation of spatial targets. So they speak faster by not achieving their targets, by undershooting them, right? So not making their vowels as extreme, keeping the tongue in the middle of the mouth instead of like it's not worth it to move this far forward or that far back because I'm just going to have to move again, right? So and there's some subset of people that can actually increase the peak velocity of their movements, but that's not everybody. Many people in their normal conversation rate are already reaching the maximum peak velocities that they use, and they do that all the time. Like you're completely stressing your vocal tract apparatus all the time. And so there are these like individual differences, which means that if you just tell somebody to speak fast or speak slow, some subset of the people will do it, but they don't do the same thing. So so it's really like how they interpret the task. And then like how we measure speech rate is like, sometimes it's like in syllables per second, but sometimes it's in like centimeters per second. Right? So it's like, well, what do we mean by speech rate, right? So if you keep the centimeters per second measure of speech rate the same, right? But you get fewer or more syllables per second, right? At that measure, you've increased your speech rate, but at the other measure, you haven't. How were you able to do that, right? And one last thing to say on that, there's a kind of relatively recent paper in cognition that looks at spontaneous speech. And they look at fast talkers and slow talkers and spontaneous speech. And do you know what the fast talkers do?
Oh.
They use high frequency words.
Yeah.
That's the other way to do it. Just don't use low frequency words because those on average take longer to say. So just forget about it. Yeah. Okay. So, but so there's all these like different levels at which, some like, so if you ever wanted to speak faster, right? Like in life, like you're in a hurry, right? Something's important, right? Then they're like, it's so integrated, right? You'll use lower frequency words, you use different types of syntactic structures. That's the way you'll kind of like achieve it. So like, in a way, it's like, and then if you simplify the task to try and really get down to like some kind of like mode or level, right? You still see like variability, like in what, unless you get so low that it starts to become uninteresting. So it's like, yeah, it's tricky, but I would say that the relative timing, I don't think you can just scale that. It would be nice.
It makes a difference for this interface, if you have a peak of activation and then you ultimately send something to the muscles, right? And that will be a rate-coded signal. If the descending neuron sends more activation, the muscle will contract more or faster. And so the thing that John was hinting at, how you get from the peak, reading out the peak location and putting it into your task dynamics, that isn't really dynamic per se. And we have proposed a certain way to do that. How do you read out the peak location? And so we've proposed something that we use in robotics, which might be relevant for things like a rat navigating. There are these in the rat, there are these head direction cells that are sort of heading direction actually. And there's some way of how they would link, but that's quite a complex thing because then actually the local mode, which are again oscillations. But in the context of arm movements, for instance, which are timed and which you can synchronize, across limbs and with time-varying things and catching balls and so, their timing plays a big role. There, it looks like the right interface is that you have a population and it's really the population itself that makes the timing, peak going up and going down just in the right time. And that is actually what can be described by something like a task dynamic. So that amplitude, neural amplitude would be the X, that you write down. So that's why I'm asking you. But maybe it doesn't necessarily have to have all these fine. It's actually a problem to have enough substrate to have different time courses, because in the brain, when you have these kind of oscillations, it's actually not easy to tune the frequency of those. Typically, the thought is that you need different neurons to do different frequencies, because the network determines the frequency, and therefore you need, and you can't change these connections in real time. You have to take a slightly different population. So you have a field of oscillators, and you would shift it around and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
We do some work in that direction with reaching an object movement, for instance. Some work Stefan shows in one version, the arm is actually driven by oscillators that are sort of that nature. If that's relevant for speech, that was my old thought when like 30 years ago. But of course, I don't know if that's really buying you something.
Well, I mean, I think some improvement of like slotting the kind of like field location of the activation peak into the other equation. I think be keen to like pursue alternatives to that.
Yeah, I can send you that DFT model if you want.
Yeah, sure.
We could have a chat about it or whatever, which implements that type of a mechanism, and then tries to close the loop where you set the attractor states for the articulatory gesture, and then we were using Tada to basically present the resulting acoustics to the model.
Yeah.
And that would then allow for a condition of satisfaction to say, this was my phonetic target, set the kind of attractor state for the gesture, produce the acoustics, and then say, have I achieved my target? In which case, then I move on to the next target. That's kind of the idea of that model. How successful we were is another question, but yeah, I mean, we did discover some interesting things about sort of how, as you sequence from target to target, that was kind of the action around the stuttering ideas we were exploring. Because you had to then set the target for the initial gesture, and then have a condition of satisfaction from the auditory side to then release to go on to the next target. And that was where the system was getting stuck, was the kind of initial movement from the first target to the second target, which is a common feature of stuttering, essentially.
So is this kind of condition of satisfaction, is that a mechanism for then kind of like learning like a forward model that wouldn't need to have auditory feedback, or is that the kind of the whole, because like some models like like a Diva model, they would use that to kind of like learn initial kind of like forward mapping, but then they would just run the forward mapping, and there are like certain types of I mean, so some sounds are, some like movements are fast, and so like you can't really wait for the auditory feedback, because like you're like 200 milliseconds behind schedule, which is like you're like a half a syllable behind. So for vowels it would be okay, but for something like a trill or a tap, right, which only takes 20 milliseconds, there's not enough time for the auditory signal to come back to verify that.
Conditions of satisfaction allows you to have a separate route how you make that prediction when you're done. So you don't have to go through the articulatory system. I should also, this does overlap with what I just said, in that I would say, oscillators, but it's actually not oscillators, it's actually active transit. It's just one time course that's generated, and then it's done. And then actually even periodic movement is in that sense a sequence of discrete events, because the kind of neurons that drive one movement are different from the neurons that drive the return movement. So they are actually, if anything, they are alternating discrete movements. And certainly in tasks like that will be it's just that they're timed, that they have a time course that is intrinsic. And so the condition of satisfaction is on the limit case of that. It can, under some circumstances, mathematically, it's a special case of that, because it's also essentially always the interplay between an excitatory and an inhibitory population. So the excitation drives the inhibition, and then the inhibition suppresses the excitation, and then you're done.
Yeah.
It no longer drives the inhibition, then the inhibition goes away, right? This is sort of the active transient nature. And condition of satisfaction is just a more general way how one could conceive of that, where the prediction of what would be the condition to be done is encoded in some connectivity that doesn't have to be muscles or articulators. It can be just neural.
So with this so this kind of like, I guess, family of mechanisms, so would this impact, say, our kinematic variables? Like, should we expect to be so like one of the kind of like a lot of the work is like in kind of on the articulation side is going from the kinematics to the dynamics. So like being able to like have a dynamics that characterizes those kinematic variables, and like just that part is tricky. And like part of the point that I was trying to make today is that like actually maybe like it's not like you solve this and then you go on to some other part of the system. You kind of like have to have at least some sketch of like the whole system, even to zoom in on some part, right? The kind of like we divide and conquer thing has its like has its limitations. And so like the work that like Mike and I have been doing on like, so I said like I gave that kind of like gesture equation, the damped mass spring, and said, but actually, like we all know that this is wrong, right? That it doesn't like there's certain aspects of the kinematics that it doesn't, like the timing of the velocity peaks and things.
So sorry.
So like so the question that I'm asking is like, if we kind of like pursue like are we going to be able to replace, so like will this kind of like replace that level, right? So can we go from our intentions to our kinematics? Should we raise the bar, raise our expectations such that we should be explaining our kinematic variables from this mechanism?
And potentially, I think, of course, I don't know if the domain enough to see if that actually ultimately pans out. I mean, in the work we do with arm movements, it does, where there were analogous models where you set attractors and so on. And there it does make a difference. Essentially, you think of the neural signal being more a velocity type signal. So it sends down the movement, and then there is a need to also integrate to get the final postural state, which in the case of an arm movement has to do with the reflex loops, right? The reflex is resisting the movement, and you have to reset the reflexes. I don't know if that's relevant for the tongue and these sort of systems. So that actually makes everything much more agile in a way, and it's sort of like anticipation, right? That you're sort of 90 degrees ahead in time. Velocity is always in advance over everything else. So your neural signal is in advance over, for instance, even the attractor position, and then of course also the oscillator itself, which makes coordination much easier and anticipation. So for instance, you might know that in tapping and coordinating movement with metronomes, people typically synchronize their peak velocity with the metronome, not really the position. That sort of reflects that there is a particular thing that they synchronize, which is sort of the neural signal. Of course, it's a very different system.
Yeah, I mean, when we were looking at this stuff a couple of years ago, the dream was, could we take like actually a real tongue model like the DIVA folks use, right? And essentially set the, positional targets using DFT, and then actually implement that with a real tongue model to produce, the acoustic feedback that you would get from that gesture. And that would be a fantastic program of work, I think, to try.
The DIVA model is Frank Gunther, right? Is that the See, that's integrate to endpoint, right? So I believe, right? Conceptually, it's integrate is equal to endpoint. It's the Bullock-Prosper kind of model.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Which is also, in my view, is one level too low in derivative. So it's sort of positional, right? It's sort of, it integrates until you're there. And I don't think that that's right. I think you send an active signal, which would be, the velocity type signal. I say that metaphorically. I mean, it's just a neural signal. And it's a separate thing if you really have a movement to then make a posture stay there and stay there, which in speech might not actually even happen. Or I don't know, maybe it happens a little bit, but maybe
Not
not so
much.
important. Yeah, not much. And so the alternative to that is where the signal that comes down is temporally structured. So it's essentially peak velocity that you have to know the duration that you're going to get. It's sort of all one.
Yeah, but isn't that, I mean, come from sort of said the rate code picture sets an attractor land, a fixed plane attractor that has a rate of change toward the attractor. Doesn't that specify the velocity of approach toward that position? So that's something that
Jason, right? Ask me.
I'm asking you.
Okay. Sorry, then I didn't understand it.
So in the rate code picture in DFT, we're setting the fixed plane attractor of the articulatory gesture.
Yes.
But then the rate, you're also specifying the rate of change toward the attractor, which is the velocity.
So I mean, the rate code picture that we have in the book, which is this sort of robotic example, that is more, I think, what Jason does, except it's done dynamically, which is really computing a postural state in a way, right? A target attractor. And I think that's more or less metaphorical. I don't think that that's neurally correct, and I kind of de-emphasize that in my teaching now. And I think of the correct interface with the motor system in my language is always timing. It's always generating a time course. Movements are time courses. You have to get the muscles going and stop again. And the antagonist, it's much more complicated with all the different muscle systems you have. You have to break the movement actively and so on. And it is true that you do reach postural states in some conditions in the musculature of the body. We have these spinal reflexes, which are all about posture, right? They ultimately resist stretch. So you have to integrate alternate the posture position. But the movement itself is that generating a time course, and that's not correctly captured by this reading of the peak and putting it as an attractor. So I think of that as more as a placeholder. It's actually, I think it's literally the placeholder for navigation. And navigation is essentially heading direction dynamics, which is quite literally actually can be fits data, human data, how they behave like that. And that is sort of a more macroscopic level of description. It's not the movement, right? It's more like the path, and then the movement is done, by the limbs in some funny way. and actually, the limbs do have timing, right? They actually coordinate and this swing state. We actually made locomotory models, which is quite a different system. So I think this idea that it is timing that makes the interface to the motor system, I think it's a very general idea. But the motor literature is quite confused about that. I would say a lot of it's a huge mess because of people thinking optimal control and things like that. And that is the optimal control is what kind of signal do you need to arrive at the target? And yes, of course, in some sense, the nervous system has to solve a problem like that, but it solves much more, right? It also solves to do it in the right way, to be there at the right time, to coordinate. There's co-articulation, right? That you already start your back movement, or you take all of that into account. So that's much more than just achieving a postural state.
Right.
I'm not saying that that solves everything. There's still very complicated problems, but it makes the interface to the fields and the peaks much more appealing. Essentially, the timing is really just peaks that have a time course that come up and go down. Active transients, right? Come up, and then the inhibitory takes it down. Again, with the condition of satisfaction being sort of a special case of that.
Well, this if the velocity signal is really kind of like the driver, I mean, so you have, and you need, I'm trying to like put this, I guess I don't fully have the conceptual tools to kind of like take what you said and put it into.
You seem to think the parameter is the location of the peak. The peak just stands there and says, here, this is the parameter, and you're reading where it is. You know, and one possibility would be that there would be some level, maybe in the same field or some other field, where the peak is coming up and you know, at a particular location, and then it's going down again. And that activation itself is what is transmitted to the muscles. So the timing signal is that, because there you have rate, right? The activation is rate.
But I guess so that's fine. I can see that picture, but I guess the question is that in addition to the postural state? So it's the picture that you're setting.
So in our picture, the postural state is in addition to that. That is, the postural state is integrating over that and predicting where it will take you. And in reaching movement, there is some evidence that you do that, you know, and I can actually look at some studies of that.
So if you, I mean, it's
But you don't always
then say, Jason, you can keep the same conceptual picture that you're setting. There is a postural target. But the dynamics of how you get there is characterized by the dynamics of peak activation.
It would be, I mean, of course, I don't know if there's a lot more that needs to be known here that I don't know. But in a certain picture, it would be a very much more radically dynamical thing. That is, when you're talking about the interaction of these different levels, the intentions and the particular dynamics, so it would be even more integrated if the way you generate the intention is already part of the control.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's realistic. You know, maybe there's something I'm missing here.
I don't know either. I think it's a place, but like even if we end up there, which would be great. I mean, it would be great if that worked. I mean, that's even if we end up there, I would probably have to explain it to people in steps.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's also good to have limit cases, right? So you have an approximation and then you refine it. And so I don't think one can all just, it's no such thing as an ultimate equation. It has to be different stages that you can then explain as limit cases of each other.
Yeah, so we've been having lots of fun writing different equations for the dynamics for that equation, right? And so like maybe that could be like a level of description that could be equally achieved, you know, with kind of like other types of mechanisms. It wouldn't necessarily invalidate that description, but it's just like, how do we put this into the neural dynamics? Like how is this run?
Actually, it's literally what we do. We can replace sometimes our arm dynamics by something like an attractor dynamics of this kind. And that's like an approximation. And then if we are more ambitious to take into account muscles and reflexes, then we can replace it by that other picture.
Yeah. Oh, but I just feel like we're doomed to fall in love with our theory as a kind of like a description of the data, and then we think it's real until we have another theory, and then we say, oh well, this old theory, that's a good description of the data, but this one is really real, and then you just
exactly
further behind it. But
I like to say theory is actually really just approximations, you know. You know, I always say Galileo, we say he invented found the law of free fall, but he actually found that it's a good idea to neglect friction. It's all just about having the right limit cases.
Yeah.